Okay, I think we have enough people in the room to start off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the India Green Steel Network's third Green Steel 60 knowledge sharing session for 2025. Thank you so much for joining. I know it's Diwali next week, and a lot of people might be on leave already, so really appreciate you taking the time. I'll quickly set the stage for our discussion today. As we know, achieving climate neutral targets for steel steel neutrality is key to decarbonization, but the question really for today is, what will the next generation of steelmaking look like globally, and what technologies will lead the way? We will also unpack what this transition means in practice, especially for H2 DRI investments in the run-up to 2030. Next slide, please. Okay, before we begin, I would love for you to please introduce yourselves in the chat with your name and organization, as well as where you're joining us from, just so that everyone knows who's in the room. Next slide, please. Okay, let's quickly take a look at today's agenda. So we'll begin with a presentation from Ysanne. She's the project lead for global steel transition at Agora Industry, followed by a presentation by Neelima, who's the Director for State Initiatives at India Energy Climate Center at UC Berkeley. After both the presentations, we'll open the floor for questions. So feel free to post them in the chat throughout, and then I'll come back to them once the presentations are done, and we'll wrap up the session with a short poll. Next slide, please. So a brief introduction for those of you who are not familiar with Green Steel 60 series. This is a series of 60-minute knowledge sharing sessions that the IGSN organizes once every quarter. We're hoping to increase the frequency starting next year. The sessions are designed to help us get to know more about the work of the network members and the broader steel community. And the idea is to keep you updated on what the others are working on and explore possible areas of collaboration. Next slide, please. Okay, to start us off, let's hear from Ysanne Choksey, who's a project lead for global steel transition at Agora Industry. Her work focuses on industrial decarbonization, especially through green iron trade and next generation steel and iron making, and on providing governments with the technical and strategic expertise to realize economy-wide changes related to transition. Her presentation will look at where the global steel industry stands today, and we'll also explore what kind of policy mix could help de-risk green steel projects and make large-scale transition truly feasible. Ysanne, over to you. We can share the screen. Yeah. Okay.
Hi there. Thanks very much. Yeah, so just to start off with, this is a presentation, or this is a piece of analysis that we have developed over the course of the last 4 or 5 months now. It's an analysis that is supposed to be a 2-year update to the 15 Insights paper from 2023, which looked at steel decarbonization scenarios for 2050. So what kind of technologies would be able to be deployed at scale at this point, and also looking at investment timelines as well. So where are the actual times that you can actually invest in these according to investment windows due to blast furnace relining dates and so forth. So that was the idea of the 15 Insights paper, and we decided to look again at the same data to say, okay, so where are we, or updated data to say, okay, where are we now 2 years on, and how far do we still need to go? So yeah, next slide, please. So the agenda of this presentation is going to follow. Firstly, we look at 2030 steel emissions projections. So looking forward over the next 5 years, where do we think steel emissions will go? Then looking at next generation steelmaking, what kind of technologies are we going to use for the next generation of steelmaking, net zero steelmaking? Then thinking about unlocking hydrogen, so to make sure that it's not a halfway transition based on natural gas. What are the bottlenecks of building out a DRI capacity supply chain? And then thinking about the policy mix and the international collaboration that's needed to push these decarbonisation strategies forward. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So starting with steel emissions, next slide, please. Starting with steel emissions, one of the findings that we initially came up with for this piece of analysis was that we think that steel emissions have already peaked and peaked in 2021. So if you look at the difference between 2021 and 2024, it's relatively small. So 1,950 tons of steel produced in 2021, leading to emissions of 3,397 million tons of carbon. That's going down in 2024, you can see, to 3,322 million tons of carbon. So it is more like a plateau and less like a peak. And this is mostly to do with production. So essentially production has slightly gone down, which means that emissions have slightly gone down. So one of the aspects of this slide that's important to note is that we look at production route. So the production route has not changed. The vast majority of steel is still made with blast furnaces, the integrated route through blast furnaces. That number hasn't really changed since 2021, which means that this is all based on lower production from lower demand. And ultimately that has led to less emissions. So we call it an unstable plateau because as soon as demand starts going up again, production starts going up again, that will lead to also emissions going up again as well. Next slide, please. Looking forward, though, to 2030, we do see changes in the types of technologies that are used to produce steel. So this would mean production swaps and capacity swaps and switching over from very high intensity CO2 intensity to lower CO2 intensity ways of making steel by 2030. And overall, we see this switch, meaning that there is an estimated 5% reduction by 2030. So how is that happening? Firstly, if we look into the activity change in China, we see around blast furnace production or blast furnace capacity going down by around 100 million tons of production by 2030. However, that is almost completely eradicated by the fact that we see capacity increases in blast furnaces in India, coal-based DRI in India, and also blast furnace capacity in Southeast Asia as well. We do see some switching over to scrap-based EAF of minus 50 million tons, so switching from blast furnace over to scrap-based EAF. And we also see switches to lower carbon iron making as well. So natural gas-based DRI plus EAF of 30 million tons, and natural gas to H2 DRI of 10 million tons, and then H2 DRI straight to H2 of 10 million tons as well. So around 100 million tons of lower carbon steel, resulting in around a 5% decrease in emissions. But that is nowhere near where we need to be. If you go to the next slide, please. So if we do think that there's only a 5% reduction by 2030, that means we have 90% still to go to reach net zero by 2050. And also in terms of the scenarios by the IEA, we're quite well off the the NZE 2050 scenario, which would say that we would be by 2030, 23% less emissions compared with 2019. However, the APS scenario or the announced policy scenario would see a reduction in around 8%. So we're quite close to what we think is the APS scenario or what we see as the APS scenario, but we're very far off from the NZE scenario or the net zero scenario. And still have 90% to go. In terms of business as usual scenario was looking at an 8% increase by 2030. So it didn't take into account production going down and emissions going down, which we found quite interesting. So we've peaked sooner than we thought, but we still have a long way to go to actually reach net zero by 2050. And progress is too slow currently to say that we are on a good path towards net zero production. Next slide, please. So this just summarizes basically what I just said. So with regards to the 2030, we see steel sector on a trajectory for around 5% emissions reductions compared to 2020 levels. This would broadly be in line with the required emissions reductions of the IEA announced pledges scenario, which would lead us to around a 1.7 degree scenario, but that would require around 8% emission reductions by 2030. Next slide, please. So this is thinking about what kind of steel making can actually deliver those kind of emissions reductions by 2050. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, we do see a bigger role than is currently being used by scrap-based steel. So we think scrap-based steel can supply around 40 to 50% of steel by 2050. Currently, it's around 22% of steel is made through scrap-based. And if you add DRI that goes through an EAF afterwards, then you get around 30% of steel that is non-blast furnace integrated route. So around 30% of steel is in the lower carbon category, but that 70% is blast furnace in the integrated route. So we think that that can be pushed up to around 40 to 50%, 50% being ambitious but achievable. But that would mean around 1,000 million tons of production done by scrap-based steel, leaving us with around 1,000 million tons of production that would be still needed to deliver clean primary steel production. So in terms of our demand figures, we got this from the Net Zero Industry paper, and we see demand as going to be around about 2.1 billion by 2050. So we don't go with the larger demand estimates of, say, 2.7 billion by 2050. Instead, we go with a more conservative estimate, also including a lot of material efficiency in those demand estimates as well. So we see that around 1,000 million tons of production is going to be needed from the primary steel route, which means that we have to deliver that through net zero pathways and net zero technologies. Next slide, please. So what will those be? Well, this slide is really designed to compare two of those technologies. So thinking about DRI and CCS, and it's quite a, it's quite a rough way of comparing them. So this is basically comparing them on the basis of investment decisions that have already been made. So blast furnace with post-combustion CCS, we see as not playing any kind of a major role in net zero by 2050. Part of the reason that we look to historically is the fact that steel companies don't believe it will play a major role, because when they are pushed to make decisions on based on a carbon price or based on the end of free allowances of that carbon price, they are not investing in CCS. They are investing instead in DRI, because they seem to be banking on DRI as being the game changer when it comes to decarbonizing primary steel. So that's one of the reasons. We do broaden that analysis as well in the briefing paper that we're currently writing to accompany this analysis. We broaden that to look at also the cost inefficiencies of CCS on a blast furnace, and also the difficulty of actually capturing that amount of CO2 as well, and the difficulty with also the range of capture points that you have on an integrated blast furnace. Next slide, please. So having said that, DRI will be the major game changer in terms of technology to deliver us a decarbonized primary steel sector by 2050. We wanted to look at where the project pipeline is at the moment. So around 89 million tons of low carbon DRI projects have been announced over the past few years. And this slide shows you, firstly, on the left-hand side, it shows you what stage they are in terms of completion. So 5 million tons already completed, 27 million tons under construction, 13 million tons have already reached FID, and 44 million tons are still at the announcement stage. And you also see a very large range of those DRI projects across the entire globe. Next slide, please. So this slide looks at the regional breakdown. So where are those actually happening? So yes, there might be projects located everywhere, but we see regional domination happening in the EU and the MENA region as well. So really thinking about, firstly, where they are in terms of their progress in terms of the project pipeline. So what you can see is that the MENA region is actually ahead of Europe when you only take into account the projects that are moving past announcement stage, and you see that there are more stalled projects in Europe than in the MENA region. However, when you look at the type of fuel, you'll see that the MENA region is still more dependent on gas than EU, which has more ambition when it comes to switching straight over to H2. Next slide, please. So this is showing you out of those FIDs, like how far along are we basically? And we have 45 million tons that have already reached FID. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm running through this because I don't have so much time. But we see by 2027, we think that that number can go up to around 67 million tons that will have reached FID by 2027, which will convert into projects of around 45 million to 62 million tons of new DRI capacity by 2030. There is a number that are often touted that if we really want DRI to be the driver of capacity build-outs in the 2030s and then the 2040s as well, then we need at least 100 million tons of low-carbon DRI by 2030. That's really what we're aiming for. But what this slide does show is that we do think we are on the way. We're not nowhere, but we're not doing it fast enough to be compatible with 2030 or 2050 net zero steel. Next slide, please. So this is really trying to problematize staying at a halfway transition. So we do not advocate for new gas infrastructure, for instance, to be built up around DRI plants. And we also see the problem of DRI staying dependent on gas for much longer than the original planned exit dates were. We do not want to see DRI being dependent on gas up until 2050 because really it's only delivering 50% of emissions at best. And that's when you have really immaculate extraction and also transportation of natural gas from extraction point over to use point as well. So the essential thing is what we're trying to say is we don't want to stop at a halfway transition. Next slide, please. But that means we need hydrogen. So hydrogen uptake is at risk without clear policy signals to allow iron and steel makers to fully transition to H2-based steelmaking. Next slide, please. So how do we unlock that hydrogen? And also how do we build out the renewables capacity to fuel it? Next slide, please. So decarbonizing steel and putting it all on hydrogen will require huge amounts of new renewables resources to be built out. So around 1,000 million tons of DRI based on hydrogen will require just under 50 million tons of hydrogen consumption. And that will result in just under 3,000 terawatt hours of new renewables electricity that will be needed to support that DRI, hydrogen-based DRI infrastructure. So what we're trying to really say in this analysis is also that we need to think about rapid, clean deployment of renewable electricity, grids, and H2 infrastructure for production, transport, and storage as well. And noting that these supporting infrastructures have very long lead times and need to be coordinated at an early stage, and planning is absolutely essential. And then reiterating that natural gas-based DRI production needs to have a clear pathway to access renewables and clean H2 to avoid stalling at a 50% transition. Next slide, please. So where is the H2 project pipeline at the moment? So what we see is that we're not lacking in announcements. So as we saw before, we'll need around 50 million tons of clean hydrogen in order to decarbonize steel completely by 2050. There's a project pipeline of already existing 26 million tons of clean H2 by already in the works globally. So we don't need so many more projects. What we need is to move those projects from announcement into FID. And you can see that that is really low when it comes to actually transmorphing these from just announcements to FID. And why is that? It's partly because low carbon hydrogen costs have been higher than most studies previously expected 2 years ago. Transportation of hydrogen via ships in gas form or in liquid form seems to be very difficult and actually seems to be totally unfeasible, which means that people are starting to look down the value chain. Like, for instance, at Agora, we have a green iron trade project that we're running where we're thinking about embodied hydrogen in the form of HBI being transported as green iron. And then also, lastly, the policy framework to incentivize FIDs for low carbon H2 has not been fully fit for purpose yet. Next slide, please. So what we see is that steel can be an off-taker and can actually drive demand for low carbon hydrogen. So the idea with this slide is to show that 39 million tons of H2 DRI projects could deliver off-takers and could deliver an off-take of around 1.9 million tons of H2, which means that if they were attached to the DRI projects, they could essentially become a very useful off-taker and drive forward those FID decisions that are so badly needed in the hydrogen sector. Next slide, please. This is also looking at where hydrogen is tending to go. Most of it is going towards ammonia projects. So what we're trying to say is that actually steel should be an off-taker. It should be a designated off-taker in order to drive forward FID decisions. Next slide, please. Okay, so climate neutral steel requires reliable access to affordable renewable electricity, clean hydrogen, and supporting infrastructure. And by prioritizing steel as a key H2 off-taker sector, the right policy incentives can help to unlock more FIDs for low carbon H2 projects. Next slide, please. So what are the bottlenecks? Next slide, please. Well, firstly, it's a big task to build out this much DRI. So we are saying that by the 2040s, we're going to need around 50 million tons of new capacity per year. So that's, you know, in the 2026 to 2030, we want 10 million tons a year. By the 2030s, we're talking about 30 million tons a year. End of the 2030s, 40 million tons a year. But by the 2040s, we're talking about the need to build out 50 million tons a year. This kind of capacity build out has been seen before, as you can imagine, in China. Not with DRI, but with BF-BOF. At the beginning of the century, China was building out around 100 million tons of new blast furnace capacity every single year. But we do see this as a potential bottleneck, as there are limited companies that provide the technology for DRI, and there is also limited capacity for those technology companies to deliver multiple projects per year. So we see that as a potential bottleneck going forward into the future. Next slide, please. Also, a potential bottleneck could be iron ore grade, but we are not leaning so far into this as a potential bottleneck because we think that there are good solutions already. So deploying, for instance, DRI smelt BOF plants can deal with hematite grade iron ore quite easily, and also beneficiation is happening more with lower grade iron content to supply DR grade level. We also see the opening up of new mining projects like Samandu that is delivering higher than 66% iron content in iron ore as well. So we don't see it as too much of a bottleneck, even though currently, strictly speaking, DRI grade iron ore is currently traded at around 4% of the iron ore market globally. Next slide, please. So what we're going to need is a global large-scale uptake of DRI-based steelmaking, and it requires a concerted effort across the entire technology supply chain, from technology providers and engineering firms to steelmakers and investors, to rapidly expand annual DRI construction capacity and deployment to around 50 million tons a year by the 2040s. Next slide, please. So what is that policy mix and international collaboration? Next slide, please. So we're looking at an entire value chain approach, which is why we have upstream, midstream, and downstream. So trying to say that you need to build up the clean energy and raw material supply. In the midstream, you need climate-friendly production processes. So that's project support for those DRIs. And you're also thinking about, or we're also thinking about downstream, adding more to the demand sector. So making sure that the demand is there for those goods. Underpinning it all are enablers like finance, policy coordination, trade and technology partnerships, skilling and reskilling of workers. And I think ultimately you also have this underpinning. We've put it in the midstream section here, but we could put it in all of the sections, and actually in the briefing paper it comes as the underpinning policy of it all is a carbon price. Without a carbon price, you're really not going to close the cost gap enough, and you're going to become far too reliant on subsidies, and subsidies are not going to be politically viable at all periods. So you need to make sure that you have a carbon price to actually close the price gap between traditional coal-based steel and new hydrogen DRI-based steel. Next slide, please. So these are the kind of different actors along the entire value chain that you need, not just steelmakers, but also technology providers, also the policy institutions, and also communities and labor organizations as well. Next slide, please. So what is this all leading to? Well, at COP, we would very much like steelmakers to use this analysis, thank you, as an opportunity to signal to policymakers that they are ready to decarbonize steel, but they need the right policy framework in place. So we've written this call to action that we're asking steelmakers to sign up to ahead of COP, that will call policymakers to try and put the right policy mix in place. So we're thinking about steel as leading the decarbonisation of heavy industry, so not just steel, but leading the pathway for all heavy industry. Accelerating the deployment of clean primary steel technologies. We're really putting our thumb on the scales of DRI that is hydrogen fed as being the main technology to deliver climate neutral primary steel production, securing that renewable energy that we will need for the green hydrogen supply, strengthening governance and trade frameworks across the entire value chain, and calling for more supportive policies at the domestic level and enabling regulator environments to make the business case viable for climate neutral steel. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ysanne, for such a detailed presentation. I'm sure there's quite a few questions. I would encourage everyone to please post their questions in the chat, and then we'll come back to them shortly. I'll quickly move on to our next speaker, Neelima Jain from UC Berkeley's India Energy and Climate Center, where she works on a green steel, clean tech, trade, and power sector policy research with a focus on turning technically viable solutions into competitive, scalable strategies. Neelima will walk us through what the techno-economics tells us about H2DRI investment decisions in the 2025 to 2030 window. Over to you, Neelima. We'll share your presentation.
Thanks, Kinshu, and thanks for the opportunity. I just want to acknowledge two things first. One, my colleague Jose, who's also online, has been really leading the technical analysis on this piece, which implies all the questions will go to him. And I also want to acknowledge the impressive and the holistic work across government and industry and civil society on decarbonizing the steel sector in India. We at ICC are squarely focused on new build-outs in India. Nothing to do with brownfield, nothing to do with the existing plans. Our analysis is solely focused on new build-outs. India already has a cost edge, record low green hydrogen and the world's lowest solar plus storage bids. I mean, it's hard to keep up with all the trailblazing tenders that SECI is coming up with. One came yesterday. It just implies that making green steel, which is H2DRI steel, in India is a make in India opportunity at global prices. So through my quick presentation, I'm just going to cover why now. And of course, India's auction discovered green H2 prices, what that means for 2030 and 2035 cost, and the few time bound moves that can turn this edge into a more bankable demand, ready sites, and perhaps affordable capital as well. I also want to apologize beforehand if I break into cough mid-sentence. I'm still recovering from a very bad bout of flu. So first, why now? What's at stake if the next capacity wave goes conventional versus green, which in the context of this presentation is green hydrogen based DRI. Next slide, please. So India is about to add 200 to 300 MTP of new steel capacity by 2047. And if we build that new capacity H2DRI based, we avoid $1 trillion coal import bill. India will use about 300 million tons per year of steel in the next 10 to 15 years. And at that rate, if we were to assume a price of, say, $500 per ton, we are really leaking at least $50 billion per year in coking coal imports. So greening new capacity keeps more value at home and just helps the inflation-proof the bill. And if 200 MT of this BF-BOF is added by 2040, we lock in at least $1 trillion of coal imports over 40 years. So switching new capacity to H2DRI plus EAF substitutes import coal with domestic renewables and hydrogen. And our analysis shows that about 6.5 million additional economy-wide jobs by 2040 would be created if we were to do H2DRI build-outs. Our analysis also shows that just looking at the build-outs now across the globe, that export opportunity is between 100 to $300 billion. But the bigger value for India still lies in greening India's new domestic capacity, competing with the conventional coal domestically. So this only works because India has already discovered credible prices, both for hydrogen and for 24/7 clean power. Next slide, please. So recent SECI auctions that came out about 2 months ago they imply a green hydrogen price within the range of $3 to $3.5 per kg. These are at least 20% cheaper than many modeled estimates, including Bloomberg for India, and very close to China's expected range, which is between 3.6 to 5.9 per kg, nominal and 2025 financed. Yesterday, SECI received 2.9 rupees per unit for 2 gigawatt solar plus 4 gigawatt hour of storage. If you do the back calculation, that could count as a green hydrogen cost with reliable base load, like power at 3.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. It actually pencils under $2.5 per kg. Now this will unlock it not only de-risks the domestic prices, but it's like unlocking exports also for India. And so here's how those inputs show up in 2030 and 2035 steel costs. Next slide, please. So in 2030, there's a near parity by design. We have assumed in this slide, in these calculations, we've assumed a green hydrogen price of $3 per kg for 2030, but we already, given the prices that have been discovered yesterday, we already think that the green hydrogen price can come to $2.5. Now, so mapping today's discovered hydrogen prices, it comes to about $491 for green, which is H2DRI, versus a BF-BOF, which is 483. And let me tell you, this 483 is not inflation adjusted. So what you see on top, that $43 is the inflation because of coking coal. So if you add that, then green steel, H2DRI steel in India in 2030 is already beating the conventional prices. Again, the prices on the left are for new BF-BOF, not for old BF-BOF. So in 2035, we have a clear advantage. We've been very, very conservative in our assumptions. And mind you, all of these prices have been attested by some of the steel producers, including SAIL. And we've had very detailed discussions with them. So by 2035, look at the green prices. There is less volatility. Inputs are Indian renewables, not imported coal. However, we understand that every new technology has risks, and green steel is no exception. Yes, there is an ore quality risk. There is a technology risk. There is perhaps an execution risk. But our point is probability weighted, right? So let's go over that first hoop. Let's start with a 1 MTPA plant in India that will prove that technology risk, address the technology risk. And I mean, there are so many solutions that have already been found for ore quality in India, and we can discuss that if there are specific questions. But we think that those are risks that can be managed and addressed. Now, the minimal time-bound moves justify themselves on per ton basis and just the FX basis. If we are able to leverage the existing price wave. Next slide, please. So what are the priority actions that we need to undertake to make sure that the industry is able to achieve that scale? We think a procurement mandate would help. I do know that Steel Ministry had put together a procurement mandate and it was shot down by Department of Finance, but that shouldn't stop us as a community to continue to push forward, because Steel Ministry's own analysis shows that even a 20% share will result in less than 1% price stick on infrastructure cost. And that's still within the contingency budget, right? So I think as a community, we should continue to press on the procurement mandate, because the demand you can bank on for first few plants. That's exactly why even the green ammonia prices came down so much, because there was bankable offtakes that the industry could rely on. And I think it could play the same for green steel industry as well. We now priority lending, ECB window, of course, I mean, I don't need to explain this, but I just want to tell you one data point that we came up with. Every 100 bips that is reduced on the cost of capital, it results in at least $18 reduction per ton on H2DRI steel. And that's a powerful number, right? So if we are able to secure these long tenure loans, low-cost loans for some of the new H2DRI plans, it would go a long way, at least in the first 3-4 years. And then, of course, the green steel acceleration zone, just bringing the land, water, priority grid, single window SLAs would help, because any effective WACC reduction will just reinforce the financing lever and just crowd in some private capex. So these are some light touch, time-bound nudges that deliver demand you can bank on, and sites you can build and capital you can close. So India can at least lead globally on H2DRI by 2030 and has a decisive cost advantage by 2035. I will leave it at that and happy for any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Neelima. I appreciate you doing this. I know you're battling a flu, so really thank you for making the time and going through it such detail. We'll open the floor for questions. I know Rahul has a question on the price for hydrogen. Rahul, do you want to unmute yourself? And I know there's been some discussion in comments already, but might be worth bringing this up for discussion. Rahul, go ahead.
No, thanks, Kinshu. Thanks, Neelima. Interesting presentation. I only have one query. We have been talking about H2DRI steel for a good amount of time. The Ministry of Steel is very keen to do, decarb story. We have been hearing about the $500 million of fund that's around the corner. But principally, what I was wanting to ask, what is the break-even number that we are thinking on the green hydrogen price that probably would make the magic work in terms of DRI green steel. I understand CCUS is probably a little far off as of now, but what is that matching number because as of now, Indian industry has been very bullish about $3.50 per kg of hydrogen. But is it like we still need to work around that part? Thank you.
So I think our analysis, thanks for the question, Rahul. Our analysis shows anything. So the graph that you saw on the picture, we have assumed a $3 price. But yeah, anything below $3, which we think is achievable today on the back of the tenders that came out yesterday, the solar storage tender that came out yesterday. So yeah, anything below $3, we think should make you invest now. But that's the price range. But in 2035, of course, we were assuming a $2.5 per kg, which is decisively very competitive and much lower than 15% lower than the conventional steel.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see a question from Nini. I know it's been answered by Ysanne, but wondering if you want to still come in, Nini, or should we move on to other questions?
Thanks, I'm fine.
Okay, Okay, great. Okay, I see another question from Sanvid. Sanvid, why don't you unmute yourself and maybe also introduce yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Kinshu. Hi, I'm Sanvid. I'm a trade lawyer. I currently work at Tulip Consulting, and we are doing a project on India's steel decarbonization and how trade can play a big role in this. So looking at EU's steel sector, given that 26% of all of India's steel exports go to the EU and it's a big market, but given the recent moves, including CBAM and the recent safeguard measures, the steel sector for the EU is also very important and restrictions are increasing. So instead of steel exports, do you see a potential for hydrogen-based DRI exports to the EU, which then the EU can use for steel, given the incoming restrictions on steel exports to the EU? And how would India fare in H2 DRI exports, given the increasing investments in the MENA region, and with Australia and Brazil being considered for H2 DRI? I'm sorry if this was covered in the first presentation. I missed that because I joined a little late. But any insights on this would be very helpful.
Who would want to take this? Please go ahead. Ysanne, go
I
ahead.
would add some points, but yes, first, Ysanne is the expert on this one.
Yeah, so this really feeds into our green iron trade work that we've done. So in terms of volumes, we're talking about maybe Europe needing around 20 to 30 million tons of iron by 2050 that is coming from abroad. So we think that the iron needs by 2050 will be around 57 million tons of iron that is needed in the steel sector in the EU. We are hoping that the EU can domestically do that through the projects that it's already announced. So 34 million tons, we're really working hard to get those over the line. But then that leaves an iron gap of around 20 to 30 million tons of needed iron. So that's the kind of volumes that we're talking about. Currently speaking, there's around 89 million tons globally of green iron projects that have been announced. So that's a much bigger number than the number that Europe can take. So I think that's important to note here, is that we need other off-takers like Japan, like South Korea, like China to start also becoming demand markets. Otherwise, Europe becomes by 2050 flooded with an ocean of green iron, and therefore it will make projects kind of, I don't know, too cheap, I guess, and Europeans would struggle to compete with them. In terms of the MENA region, yes, the Duqm port is starting to become like a location where we're seeing DRI take off. So that's Meranti steel and also Jindal steel as well. So that's around about 8 million tons of capacity from those two companies that are building out there. Different timelines when it comes to H2. But yes, they are, we see MENA region as being very competitive. I mean, right now they have access to very cheap gas, but in the future they also have, Oman specifically has an H2 plan in place. But yes, yeah, so those are the kind of things. In terms of India competing with them, I think India has a very good chance, seeing as they have this, what Neelima was talking about with the delivery of cheap green hydrogen, which has been not actually achieved in many other places. So I think in terms of that, India has a very good chance of becoming competitive with the likes of MENA region, especially if we tighten the rules on green hydrogen, and also places like Brazil as well.
Neelima, would you like to come in?
I just want to add that as far as India is concerned, I think the domestic demand is so huge that for us, green steel is more of a domestic case for scale than the export case. And I mean, export is nice to have, but just look at the amount of the forecast that exists on steel in India. So I think we should, as a community as well, also try and see how we can tweak our narrative more and more in favor of the domestic market. Because at least if you look at how currently the industry is panning out across the globe, everyone is looking at indigenizing their steel. And I think if we want to look at the right scale and the right prices, India's domestic market is should be the go-to market for steel producers.
Thank you. This is really helpful.
Thanks. Nandan, I see your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Both the presentations were so interesting. I have one simple question for both of you. Neelima, could you share any thoughts on, just in terms of the enablers, which of the enablers do you think are sort of most critical sort of prerequisites? And if there's any sequencing of them, is it electrolyzer scale? Is it water? Is it the pipeline infrastructure? Or anything else? Like just in terms of what you think is really the most critical just between now and say 2030 to get right? And Ysanne, quick question. I think you mentioned a little bit about the scrap EAF growth. Do you have any sense of what that outlook is for India? And have you looked at the Indian scrap ecosystem at all? Would be great to get any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Nandan. I think one, if you were to remove all the recommendations in the wish list of the CSOs, I think one that has to just stand out and is absolutely necessary is a demand signal from the government. All that we need is a procurement mandate. I think that's all that what the industry is waiting for. Even a 5% procurement mandate in public procurement would do that trick. We are way past the pilot sizes. The pilot size, I mean, pilot scale is great, that is happening in India. But look at the progress we've been able to make on the new pilots, on the new H2DRI pilot. No one would come in because that's not a scale that makes economic sense. So I think my first priority would be pushing on, having that procurement mandate. And if there is any room, then low-cost financing. I think those are the two biggest levers. Everything else will just work for itself.
Ysanne, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So in terms of scrap, firstly, we haven't done any deep research on India, and we also haven't done any deep research on scrap. So these are two areas that you're scratching an itch for me, because I want to do research on scrap, but it doesn't tend to be that favored, because there's this sense of it's a zero-sum game. Because if you can't increase availability a lot of scrap, then you're just shuffling it from one place to another, and it's not actually decarbonizing, it's just moving it from one place to another. So that's definitely the predominant opinion from, for instance, European stakeholders. However, I think what is clear, or what seems obvious, is that India will come into a scrap boom in the next couple of decades based on infrastructure that was built in the 1960s and 70s, and will start to become usable in terms of the scrap market. So I think that that's true. I also think that that's true of China, and I think that we will see the ability for Indian steelmakers to lean further into that scrap boom by building out more EAFs. I mean, currently Europe has very high rates of recycling. So it collects most of its scrap. It also recycles most of its scrap relatively efficiently, even though a lot of it is still downcycled, so it doesn't go into the same quality level as it was. But the main problem is that, so we have very high levels of scrap-based steelmaking at 45%, and we expect them to go up to 55%. So I think in India there is room for growth with scrap-based steel. But as I said, I don't have the numbers because we don't do research on it, but I would very much like to do more research on it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, Neelima, your point on like demand being very critical was really pleasing to hear, but that's the kind of work we're now sort of looking to do, or we have been doing on climate catalyst, and we'd love to share some research that's coming up fairly soon on this. But thanks for sharing, and Ysanne, thanks as well.
I see a question from Ankur. Ankur, do you want to quickly unmute yourself and ask the question, and also tell us who the question is for?
Hello everyone, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. Actually, I would like to ask my question to Ma'am Neelima, ma'am. I am also finally in a PhD, I'm a PhD scholar. I am working on this area only. So my area is a spatial. I'm also including spatial studies while contributing to techno-economic analysis of green steel. So in that, I found this one more area that should be taken with time. According to what I perceive from my studies, that with this shift towards green hydrogen and renewable based steel making, the transition can reshape that India's steel cluster geography could be shifted towards non-traditional areas. By traditional area, I mean that generally that steel industries was found to be near the cluster of ore where we can see the ore and other resources. But I think with this RE potential areas which has more renewable energy potential, maximum scrap generation potential. So is there a possibility that these industrial clusters can shift to a new non-traditional area? So I wanted her answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Ankur. If wishes were horses, I would say yes, but I think so as you've pointed out, right? Like traditionally, steel making has been focused on geographically is either located closer to the iron ore mines or is located to the closer to the demand centers. Now, think about the logistics. If we were to shift steel making closer to where there are larger swaths of land available, because in terms of the radiation, there's very slight difference from one region to the other region in India. It's really about the availability of land. Now, if that happens, then think of all the costs that we add up in terms of transporting iron ore and then transporting steel to the demand centers. So practically, it may not be, or economically, it may not be a very sound decision. We have assumed that the best cost is in co-locating or co-siting the hydrogen production. I mean, otherwise, you will never be able to. We have not assumed transporting hydrogen, because if you start looking at transporting hydrogen, then there is no way that this price will beat conventional steel making. So I'm afraid that for all practical logistics and economical reasons, I do not see the new steel clusters in non-traditional areas. They have to be very much closer to either iron ore or hydrogen has to be, green hydrogen has to be produced very close to where steel making is. However, I do want to add something. We have done, and it's a positive news, we have done a very detailed land analysis. So we've looked at the existing iron ore sites, we've looked at the existing steel making sites, and we've seen, is it even possible to, to sort of build out these huge green hydrogen plants? And our analysis so far shows that we will be at least able to create. So we've analyzed about 11 million hectares of land. And our analysis so far shows that we have a buildable area that can result in a total solar capacity of at least 48 gigawatt of plants. So there is, there's huge potential for green H2 in co-siting green H2 in either the iron ore sites or the existing steel manufacturing sites.
Ysanne, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit of texture to what Neelima says from the European perspective. I think what we're starting to see is the market case or the commercial viability case for H2 DRI being really necessary to make, and it just works better in some places than others. So for instance, we've got the Stegra plant that will come online hopefully next year in 2026, the first H2 based steel plant in the world, and that will be located in a location that makes complete sense in terms of getting access to green hydrogen, electrolyzers being next to the actual plant. They're building up all of this capacity next to each other, and having also cheap electricity from regional pricing. That seems to be like really key also to why Sweden is so capable at doing heavy industry decarbonization and electrification, because they do regional pricing. So essentially, if you're producing huge amounts of renewables in one location, then it makes sense to have your industry there, because the renewables is going to be extremely cheap, which is what's happening in this area called Boden in northern Sweden. So there's just a really good commercial case for DRI in that location in Sweden. Not such a great commercial case for it in Germany, which is why we see the projects, the DRI projects, being very heavily subsidized, which we could argue is a good thing because of the steelmaking industry in Germany. But we see that this idea of commercial viability is very much based on location and access to very high levels of renewables that make it cheap to produce green hydrogen.
Thank you. Sakshi, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you both. Those are fantastic presentations. I'm sorry I sound like this. I, like Neelima, also have a cold. But I had a question for Neelima. Actually, there's two of them. So, I just want to focus on the fact that your analysis is pointing out prices of hydrogen at which H2DRI becomes cost competitive with BF-BOF, which are higher than some other estimates that we've been seeing by, say, CEW, where I think they came in the range of $1.3 to $2.2 per kg. And it's really exciting to hear that at a price of about $2.50 per kg of hydrogen, that we might still be able to see them become cost competitive, because that's extremely, it's great for the industry in India. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about where you think that difference is coming from. Is it only because you have added the cost of importing met coal, or are there other factors where you reckon there might be some differences too? That's the first question. And the second one was, I missed that full stat about low cost financing and how the impact that a 100 BPS reduction in rates could lead to. Could you please repeat that? That was really interesting. And if you could speak to the financing levers that can help push this further and where that change might come from, that would be amazing for the community. Thank you.
Sure. Let me answer the second one first. So our analysis shows that every 100 bps reduction in the cost the cost of capital will result in at least $17 to $18 reduction on the overall cost of steel making per ton. How can we bring that about? Well, it's all about risk elimination. So credit risk instruments, low cost financing can come through long tenure loans. I think right now, the way, excuse me, high street banks are lending in India, the tenure is usually 5 to 6 years. So think of, can there be refinancing by DFIs? The NFFIs of the world, NIFFs, sorry, or the or PFCs, or whichever those DFIs are, can lend a low cost financing to these high street banks, and then the high street banks just do a pass through, right? Like, so that's sort of a framework can do very well for some of the first few mid-scale size plants in India, because that's a real number, $18 per ton, and that's our, of course, analysis based on the overall cost numbers that we have come up with, and happy to share the assumptions as well. In fact, some of the key assumptions are already there in my slides that I've already shared, and please feel free to share that slide with the community. So yeah, that's a these are simple levers, and it's not that there have not been any precedents in the past. There have been many precedents of such risk instruments and long tenor loans in India, not just in the infrastructure sector, but also in RE. So I'm sure that could be looked at. Now, on to your first question, I have to say, I did look at that analysis by CEW, but I have not had the opportunity to look to do a deep dive into what their assumptions were. And so I may not be in a position to sort of say what is the difference and how this price parity we are able to show. But all I can say is that all our assumptions, we've had months and month-long of consultations with several industry players. I mean, you name it. Some of the biggest players, some of the, the smallest players, someone like SAIL. And also ISA, the Indian Steel Association. So we have made sure that our assumptions are very grounded. And in any case, at Berkeley, we're very careful about referencing assumptions. So we've been very careful about, and we've sort of ground truth all our assumptions. So I think the biggest difference that made necessarily was the green ammonia tenders that came out and the implied green hydrogen cost. That is clearly one of the biggest sort of deal makers. The second is the WACC itself, which is the weighted average capital cost. That makes a huge difference. So I don't know what CEW had accounted for. And the third is the coking coal. I would assume, all of us would have referenced SEMA, which is really where the industry, or Platts, for example, which is where we get most of our coking coal or iron ore numbers from. So yeah, I'm sorry, Sakshi, I'm not able to answer your first question because I haven't really looked at in detail the key assumptions that went into CW's analysis.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again to Ysanne and Neelima for sharing their insights. And thank you to all our attendees for being an engaging and curious audience. Before we close, we have a quick 30-second poll for our audience, just to get your feedback on how the session was for you. It'll appear on your screen now. And yeah, I hope you found today's session useful, and happy Diwali to those celebrating next week. We'll see you in our next session. Thank you.